probably the only topic more controversial than family structure and moral development is how religious beliefs relate to a happy, meaningful existence. Religious individuals find much of their meaning and moral guidance in their spiritual life, whereas non-religious individuals sometimes claim that human morality is rooted instead in universal human intuitions that we'd want to affirm whether or not we thought God was real. The question I want to ask here is how such beliefs translate into behavior and actual well-being, particularly in the lives of kids. Are children who are exposed to religious beliefs happier? Are they more likely to help others? Are they more empathetic? There's actually a lot of science on these questions, but a lot of it is very hard to interpret. This again relates to the nature of the data. Religious families generally differ from non-religious secular families in many ways, not just with respect to religion. A recent study by the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan research organization, surveyed 35,000 Americans in all 50 states to study differences between religious and non-religious individuals. What they found is that religious faith differs by age, by marital status, by income, and so on. Here are some highlights. First, younger people are much less likely to believe in God than older people. In this figure, the dark blue bars on the left indicate the percentage of people in each age group who have absolute 100% belief in God, whereas the bars on the far right indicate people who are atheist or agnostic. What you can see here is that the youngest people surveyed are twice as likely to be atheist or agnostic. Similarly, in this figure, you can see that religious belief differs by income. People who earn $30,000 or less, the people near the top of the figure, are about 13% more likely to have absolute belief in God relative to individuals who earn over $100,000. Differences related to education look almost identical. People with PhDs are 14% less likely to have absolute belief in God relative to people with high school or less. The reason I list all of these differences is that when we compare religious and non-religious families, we need to be aware that religion isn't the only thing that differs between these groups. Almost everything does. And so, if we want to know whether the differences we find are specifically due to religion, we need to be very, very careful. For example, consider the case of sharing, a common metric of moral development. In one recent study, children aged 5 to 12 were given a bunch of stickers and allowed to share as many as they chose with another child. What the researchers found is that non-religious children shared more stickers than Christian or Muslim children. Also, when they showed kids videos of people pushing or bumping someone else, Christians and Muslims said that the actions were meaner than did non-religious kids and recommended harsher punishments. The problem I have with this kind of study is that it's hard to know if religion played any role in children's sharing and moral judgments at all, or if we would have found the same thing if we'd compared kids from wealthy families to kids from less wealthy families, for example. The study actually does address this concern to a degree by including socioeconomic status, like education and income, as variables in their analyses. Also, they look at factors like the age of kids. And when you look at all these variables in the study, although religious identification is a significant predictor, meaning that the effect would probably be found again if we did exactly the same study, the effect wasn't the biggest one the researchers found, and was actually smaller than effects of socioeconomic status or age, and just a little bit bigger than country of origin. And probably other differences between kids that they didn't measure also had some effect, which might even explain the effects of religion that they found. Another example of this comes from a recent report by researchers at Duke University who found that atheist kids are less likely to care about what the cool kids think and less likely to express racist beliefs. Other studies show that non-religious adults are less likely to be vengeful, are less authoritarian, and more tolerant than religious adults. But again, these groups also differ in education, income, country of origin, and so on, making it hard to know if these differences were due to religion per se. Still, it's not like we can't conclude anything from these kinds of data. We can. So far, we can conclude that there is no reason to believe that raising your kids without religion will have serious negative consequences. If anything, the evidence points to greater levels of generosity, less racism, and greater tolerance. This doesn't mean that these things are caused by non-belief, but it does suggest that these outcomes are possible without religion. Even imperfect correlational data can tell us a fair amount if we treat it carefully. It's also important to note that other correlational data paint a very different picture, specifically as they relate to happiness. A fairly well-known result is that people raised in religious households report higher levels of happiness than their non-religious peers, despite the fact that religious households tend to be less affluent and less educated. For example, the Pew study we discussed earlier found that in adults, about 40% of believers report being very happy compared to 29% of non-believers. For those who believe in God, this is great news, since there are few things we value more in life than happiness. For non-believers, it's a bit of a conundrum. It's hard to convince oneself of the existence of spiritual entities just because we think it'll benefit us. Presumably, to get these positive effects, one actually needs to really believe. Instead, non-believers might ask why religion might afford these differences. Here, there are fewer studies. One 2013 study found that religious people tend to be happier when they live in predominantly religious countries, and that this edge may stem in part from non-religious people being socially excluded or being otherwise socially unusual in their cultural context. Other studies suggest something similar. First, happiness is more strongly related to social religious practices like attending services and community events than with individual practices like prayer or meditation. Second, when we control for differences in people's social networks, differences due to religion itself disappear entirely. What these studies suggest is that if you believe in God, the way to maximize the benefits of religion for your child is to be active in your community's religious practices. And if you don't believe, what may be most important is to find ways for you and your child to become more connected to your neighbors and community in a way that builds strong connections and social support in your day-to-day life. The key to happiness may not be God himself, but how God brings people together into cohesive community groups.